So, welcome again to ODSECS 34. It's my absolute pleasure to turn the introductory duties today over to my fellow ODSECSer, Freya Gowrie, who will be introducing Stephanie today. Freya?
Hi, thank you so much for that, Elaine. I was just texting my housemate to let her know that I was doing this and therefore to limit the noise of animals and children. So apologies if there are any auditory distractions initially. But we're so delighted to welcome Stephanie O'Rourke today, who is my art history colleague at the University of St Andrews. She is our external examiner at the University of Bristol, so we're really grateful to have her here with us. Stephanie specialises in 18th and 19th century European visual culture, particularly in relation to resource extraction, scientific knowledge and media technologies. And her recent publication around these issues can be found in representations, art history, 18th century studies, and Journal 18, as well as in other places. And she's recently received a contract for her second book from the University of Chicago Press called Picturing Landscape in an Age of Extraction. And this is presumably what we're going to hear a little extract from today. Am I right, Stephanie? So yeah, we are very excited to have her with us. And yes, Steph, whenever you are ready, feel free to start.
Great. Thank you so much, Freya, for that introduction. And thanks to both you and Elaine for setting this up. I've loved the ODSECS papers I've seen, so it's really wonderful to be able to also contribute to this forum. And I appreciate everyone taking the time to sort of zoom in today. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So as Freya mentioned, I have a book coming out next year about landscape and extraction in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about some material that's running kind of parallel to it, and be a little bit more exploratory. So I hope that's all right. You'll see some of my interests, but extraction's not something I'm going to be really theorizing in this paper, although it is something that I theorize extensively in the book. And I've taken out the latter part of the title in my title slide because a good chunk of this material is also early 19th century. I hope that my ODSECS credentials aren't revoked as a result, but as we know, the centuries are quite long. So I'll go ahead and begin. And I begin with two formations. The first is the mine. There is the print, and there is also what the print encloses. Wood-colored frames, and within them two specimens of mineral-bearing rock. I'm talking about the image on the top here. Lifting the paper reveals that the interior of the two central frames has been cut out to display the lithic substrate of two separate underlying engravings. The underlying prints picture the ore samples in their so-called raw state, with uneven edges and shadows that signal the material's physical dimensionality. The engraved and hand-colored overlay transforms the rock into something more closely resembling what we now call a natural resource. The linear borders of the frame smooth the rock into legible flatness. The scalar keys at the bottom render it measurable and quantifiable, and the colored frames resemble the wooden supports of mining tunnels through which ore-rich rock was brought to the surface. The overlay, therefore, does the work of converting the mineral materiality of the subsurface world into an entity that can be assimilated by the practical and conceptual framework of ore extraction. To an extent, it replicates the operation of mining itself by rendering visible and available that which was formerly invisible and inaccessible, the vertical depths of the earth. These 1785 engraved illustrations accompany one of the 18th century's most important treatises on mining by the mining officer and mineralogist Friedrich Wilhelm Heinrich von Treber. And due in part to their intended purpose of improving German ore mining, they supply an exceptionally frank pictorial expression of an extractive way of thinking that was ascendant in Europe at the turn of the 19th century. Von Treber urged, quote, everyone in the Saxon ore mountains to constantly speculate about where to best place new extraction points and about how the existing points could be worked more advantageously, end quote. Viewing the landscape, according to von Treber, should be synonymous with furthering the profitable removal of mineral-rich ore from beneath its surface. The 1785 illustrations indicate some of the ways that pictorial representations of the natural world might support this aim. So the wooden frames and the overlay print specifically illustrate the physical infrastructure of the mine. That's especially apparent on the right side, where you see that it curves in a bit, which is how those tunnels are shaped. The wooden frames invite the viewer to look upon the rock as if peering through the entrance of a mining tunnel. At the same time, they also gesture towards some of the profound challenges that extractive industries such as mining posed to the human vantage point and to pre-existing formats for representing the natural world. In practical terms, the interior space of the mine marked a limit point for the powers of ordinary visual perception. Physically unreachable to most viewers, it was also intensely dark and dangerous. The vertical orientation of ore mining likewise relocated the valuable materiality of the natural world beneath what can be shown in the horizontal format of landscape painting. The mineral world is precisely what cannot be seen when looking at a standard topographical illustration. So in other words, these illustrations register an important tension that existed between the fantastical promise of unconstrained resource extraction and the normal means by which people perceived and understood the natural world. My second formation, the volcano. And so my paper today is trying to talk across the volcano and the mine. In the midground, the surface of the earth is sliced open in variegated streaks of yellow and amber. Pyrotechnic energy and sulfuric discharge gather in plumes above. Radiant extrusions of molten lava in the foreground give luminous form to the event's dramatic inversion of above and below, the sudden upward release of subterranean pressure. Pierre-Jacques Volaire's painting of the eruption of Vesuvius was one of many such scenes produced by the French artists in the late 18th century. Volcanic eruptions, especially of Vesuvius, were important subjects for artists like Joseph Wright of Derby, J.M.W. Turner, Horace Vernet, and John Martin, to say nothing of the many popular and technical prints in circulation. And popular attractions and prints of volcanic eruptions responded to a nascent public interest in geology, as well as the ascendance of technological forms of illusionism. Whereas in the 17th century, Kircher had sought to reassure his readers that eruptions were part of larger natural cycles of movement taking place within every celestial body. Mid-18th century accounts were marked by the emerging science of stratigraphy, which viewed the Earth as successive layers of strata whose depth also reflected the era in which they were formed. Among other things, this ushered in a newly vertical way of thinking, in which the volcano was both the most recent and the most superficial expression of an entire subsurface world governed by vertical relationality. Volcanoes were not the only landscape feature known for recurrent and sensationalized explosions in late 18th century Europe. As the industrial extraction of metal ores and coal accelerated, mines too became sites of spectacular and deadly conflagration. Not unlike an eruption, these events were characterized by the catastrophic overturning of the spatial distinction between the Earth's surface and its depths, and by the intense vertical discharge of light and energy. So Volaire's painting, I propose, articulates a new awareness that beneath the material surface of the Earth, things were in motion. This included the desired circulation of extracted resources and the potentially imperiling circulation of industrial waste. At any moment, these flows might propel themselves upward in a scene of luminous devastation. The industrial extraction of minerals expanded significantly over the course of the 18th century, especially in Britain and Sweden, German states, and in France, although to differing degrees in each place. So the export of metals and coal were major engines of economic growth. Coal especially grew in value as you saw the expansion of energy-intensive industries such as glassworks and ironworks, which came into contact with timber shortages across Europe. And so the large-scale extraction of coal would prove essential to the energy transition, now synonymous with the rise of industrial capitalism at the turn of the 19th century, memorably termed fossil capital by Andreas Malm. Seen as key to both the economic and military interests of the state, mines therefore became a focal point of state action. So in Germany, for example, the coordinated management of mines coincided with and became a vehicle for the formation of a modern technocratic state in the second half of the 18th century. Now, I'm not going to discuss this painting really, but I've included it here because it really nicely captures the dynamic whose emergence I'm going to try to trace in this paper, in which the uplifting of the mineral earth places human figures within a field of visuality that is both mediated and drastically constrained by rock. Mining in this moment required an acute understanding of the material conjunction of resource and waste. And I mean waste in this kind of new sense of that which lacks exploitable economic value. After all, the valuable mineral content of the earth was physically bound to that which had little or no capturable monetary value. So metals were deposited within lithic substrates, and coal beds were likewise flanked often by layers of obdurate non-combustive rock. So increasingly, resource and waste were understood not as kind of materials, but as economic categories into which materials were sort of separated, rather than kind of properties intrinsic to the materials themselves. And their physical separation was undertaken through the removal of ore from open pits and underground galleries, by crushing and other sorting practices at the mine's surface, and by the chemical mechanisms of smelting that typically happened on the same site. The concentration of both valuable minerals and dangerous waste intensified as a function of depth. It was routinely observed in 18th century British and French treatises that the deeper one mined, the greater the value of the material that could be extracted. And really throughout the 18th century, because you didn't have really inexpensive and effective modes of transportation, most of these operations were now what we would call kind of vertically integrated, where every kind of stage of the production process is happening on the same site. Canals would facilitate the spread of this, but it's especially the railroads, which enable those processes to be happening in different places. So one of the things that interests me a lot here is that German ore mines in particular were extending hundreds of meters into the earth over the course of the 18th century. And what you can see sort of atop this mountain scene, which is in the corner of a map, is the hydraulic pumps and some of the energy transfer systems that crisscross the surface of Central Europe's mountains, supporting the extensions of mines up to 5 times deeper over the second half of the 18th century than they had previously reached. And so especially in these Central European mountains, laborers are ascending the face of the mountain and then descending far into the depths of the mine. This vertical transit, which is taking place each day within the mountains, can be seen in an engraving from one of the period's most influential texts on mining by Johann von Charpentier. And the image, like some of the intensely vertical landscape paintings that German Romantic artists would go on to produce, is delimited by a rocky frame. To the left, a figure ascends or descends, and to the right, a solitary man mines the floor of an interior chamber whose mineral deposits can be seen in bright, upstanding veins. Miners were among the first professions in modern Europe whose labor was characterized by commuting. And I take it to be significant that their regulated, endlessly repeatable journey towards and away from the site where they produced economic value, as a newly sort of spatialized model of labor management, was organized along a vertical rather than a horizontal axis. The material conjunction of above and below, and the scaling of a mountain's surface to access its depths, rendered the mountain the site of vertically oriented spatial understanding circa 1800, what historian of science Patrick Anthony has termed the vertical consciousness of Germany in this period. And I'm trying to think about how this concept can be animated in art history and the extent to which it does or does not also capture what was happening outside of those German mountain ranges. So conceptualizing not just mineral formations, but the animate operations of nature along a vertical axis, this way of thinking found diagrammatic expression through the growing dominance of stratigraphic illustrations. Within this system, up and down were not oppositional, they were paired. They name relative positionalities along a shared vector. So the figure ascending or descending within the Charpentier plate has aligned his movement with that of the mineral veins themselves. We might say that such marks have supplanted the horizon line as the primary device through which the human orients themselves within a mineral landscape. Few captured this dynamic better than the Romantic writer Novalis, who famously referred to miners as inverted astrologers in his 1802 novel, Heinrich von Ofterdingen. Writing about granite in 1784, Goethe describes a vantage point not entirely dissimilar to the one pictured later in Friedrich's famous Wanderer Above a Sea of Clouds. I'm quoting here from Goethe. Sitting on a high bare summit and looking out over a wide area, end quote, Goethe knows that he rests, quote, directly on a ground that stretches to the deepest places of the earth, end quote. His remarks indicate very real awareness that ascending to the peak of a mountain was ultimately an act of coming into contact with the world's greatest depths. Working at the time as a mining administrator, Goethe would have himself traveled into the mine shafts that tunneled underneath German mountains. On a granite outcropping, Goethe feels himself subject to the operations of both above and below. In these moments, he continues, when the internal attractive and moving forces of the earth act directly on me and the influence of the heavens hover closer to me, I am attuned to a higher view of nature. So he's invoking a zone of interactivity that acts from both above and below. The relative positionality is so foundational to ore mining. And when I explore this painting in my book chapter, I pose the question whether the wanderer is viewing this landscape not unlike a mining administrator and understanding it as a kind of conjunction of mineral depths and great heights. The fundamentally vertical orientation required by mineral extraction stood at odds, of course, with the horizontal logic of pictorial landscapes. So in this map detail, which you see, the cross-section indicates that the visible surface of the mountain conceals a vast and intricate subsurface world containing humans, mineral-rich ore, and multi-system infrastructure to facilitate the ore's removal, smelting, and circulation. While some of the supporting infrastructure was evident to ordinary people when walking through the mountains, these constructions gave little indication of what was actually happening below. The elaborate networks of hundreds of meters of shafts and adits, entire human communities working beneath one's feet, and the unceasing transit of rock and of water beneath its static surface. When Goethe delivered an address in 1784 to mark the opening of a silver mine, he invoked the decidedly vertical movement seen in the von Charpentier print I was showing you before. Quote, men will ascend and descend within the shaft, where we will behold before our eyes with the greatest joy what we now see only in the mind, end quote. Goethe's words attest to both the axial relationship between the human and the ore mine, and to the particular mode of sightedness that the mine requires. Ordinary powers of, topographical visual representation cannot access the mine. And this is one of the ways I'm thinking about the volcano as also a kind of mountainous formation, which prompts one to understand that just beneath the surface of the mountain, you have these powerful circulating forces, which could at any moment kind of break into the surface of the visible. So returning to the Charpentier print, as I mentioned, the entire notion of a horizon line falls away. There is no point at which ground ends and sky begins, no device for ordering the spatial logic of the image beyond what the rocky enclosure permits. The vertical deposits of mineral and the vertical transit taking place alongside them supplant the need for horizontality, because the economic value latent in the rock and the metabolic labor power that will excavate it are in spatial alignment. Charpentier's print gives pictorial form to a wide-ranging shift that Jason Moore attributes to European capitalism during this moment. Moore identifies a move from the quote unquote, horizontal frontiers of territorial expansion and trade to the quote, vertical frontiers whose most prominent manifestation was the coal seam, end quote. So not just the physical structure of the mine, but the extractive logic of the mine was vertical, in other words. And neither could be adequately expressed in the wide angle, horizontally formatted topographical drawing in which 18th century landscape painters were typically trained. So when artists, a few, do adopt this sort of vertical way of picturing the landscape, and I'm showing you this Schinkel example on the right, they were compelled to embrace just how much this format radically limited what they could actually show. To look through the aperture-like opening in the rock is to accept a form of vision that is mediated by a lithic substrate. It requires seeing through an opening into the rock, an opening not entirely dissimilar to the entrances and tunnels of the ore mines beneath the surface of the mountainous landscape that you can see in its center. So I'll turn now to just a French, the first comprehensive sort of mineralogical map of France, because it captures in this very compressed sense a tension between the horizontal expanse of traditional modes of pictorially representing land. I'm thinking here about cartographic space, the lateral logic of cartographic space, and the vertical requirements of mining as a way of interacting with the earth. Exemplified in the cartouche in the bottom left. And if you look closely, you can see a deep vertical pit, which is worked by laborers with pickaxes. And so there's a kind of contrast between the lateral diegetic space of the map and the accompanying hypothetical cross-section of the mining pit, even though the activity of mining is what has animated or motivated the creation of this map. So Dupin-Triel's ambition, and he's one of many figures who's trying to navigate this at the moment, is to activate a vertical understanding of the earth within the horizontal conventions of cartographic space. Although not an eruption in any meaningful sense, it nonetheless affects an overturning of the supposedly stable separation of above and below the Earth's material surface. It wasn't just, of course, mineral ores and coal that were being brought to the surface. It was water. The cost of uplifting water was a significant hindrance to the profitability of a mine. So I'll quote an 18th century British text complaining that, quote, the eruption and excess of subterraneous waters are not worth the expense of draining them by the charge of horses and hand labor, end quote, which is how you ended up with this pump system instead, often really elaborate pump networks. So I'm showing you a plate from the Encyclopédie, which illustrates the mechanical infrastructure that was required to facilitate the vertical transit of water as well within the mine. So you end up with this kind of internal scaffolding of pumps, which were powered by water mills you can see on the top. And this was the system that was supplanted by steam engines. The Encyclopédie diagram prioritizes the subsurface infrastructure of water removal, but it was the subsequent disposal of this water that ignited controversy from the mid-19th century onwards. Interestingly, especially in France, early modern concerns about industrial effluents were not marginal or nascent or particularly weak. There was a pretty formal legal structure for people complaining about what we would now call pollution from mines. Some terms from the period include insalubrious exhalations and expirations of subterraneous bodies. This is how they described the pollutants reaching the surface world. Formal inquests sought to manage the competing economic interest of regional actors, and rural laborers and landowners alike complained about the destruction of important rivers, the ascent of slag heaps, and excessive smoke emitted from burning coal. And actually, the mining of metal was typically more destructive than the mining of coal in this regard, because the ores were smelted, as I mentioned, in these adjacent factories that released things like arsenic, sulfur, and other toxins into nearby rivers. The most dangerous waste that was released through mining, though, was invisible. which is why I don't have an illustration of it. Excavating underground, and especially in coal mines, although this was a problem in a wide range of mines, released gases that could both suffocate workers and create dangerous explosions. Mining treatises from the second half of the 18th century made extensive reference to anecdotes in which workers were incapacitated by the invisible release of gases that asphyxiated, poisoned, and otherwise incapacitated workers. The quote-unquote fatal damps, as one 1701 text reads, quote, by which many are struck blind, lame, or dead in these subterraneous cavities of the mine is wanting of a due circulation of air, end quote. Far more spectacular were the explosions that were triggered when a miner's candle or lamp came into contact with this concentration of flammable subterranean gas. So as the miner descends, quote, if the miner will carry a candle along with him, he frequently sets the whole place in a flame, end quote, whose explosive power was compared in text really from Britain, France, and Germany to lightning, thunder, the discharge of gunpowder, and above all, volcanic eruptions. And what they share is the violent upward extrusion of subterranean heat and light to the Earth's surface, often casting sort of pyrotechnic debris, gas plume, and fire high into the air above the mine. And these explosions became increasingly common into the early 19th century, especially as the coal mines found in Northeast England extended deeper into the earth. Once coal seams caught fire, it was often not possible to extinguish them. In Germany, Britain, and France, there were well-known examples of mines that caught fire and burned for years, and there was a notorious example of a single coal seam in Saxony that burnt from 1476 until 1860. So systems for regulating airflow became indispensable. Warning of the dangers of, quote, pernicious and suffocating vapors and exhalations in mines, end quote, the Encyclopédie affirmed the pervasive scientific consensus that, quote, it is of such importance to ensure that air be continuously freshened and can circulate freely in underground mines. I'm showing you a ventilation diagram from 1818, which is quite typical. It pictures the mine as if viewed from above with kind of X-ray vision cutting away the surface, the uppermost surface of the earth. And what you see in the center are circles, which designate the vertical shafts through which water, air, and minerals would transit between the subterranean galleries and the surface. Wooden air doors, which you can see marked by these sort of double lines, would help guide the air along a unidirectional pathway to facilitate its constant movement towards the upshaft, where it would be released to the surface. Tellingly, the circulation of resources was being diagrammed along a vertical axis, but the circulation of waste, at least where toxic gases were concerned, was pictured in decidedly horizontal terms. Now, this image does much to reassure its prospective viewers of the ease with which the transit of these invisible and perilous gases could be managed. This includes the gridded organization of space, the linear trajectory of the air it traces, and the clear contrast it invokes between the white space of the gallery interiors, which in reality were spaces of basic complete darkness, against the black inert substrate of rock. In nearly every way, it differs from Volaire's portrayal of Vesuvius. One is a luminous, I think I've got a comparison here. One is a luminous, dynamic portrayal of the surface level extrusion of a volcanic paroxysm painted for an elite audience, while the other is a modest, technical, black and white print of the docile circulation of subsurface invisible flows with practical use value. But what I am proposing nonetheless is that each of these images responds to and is marked by an interest in the waste set into circulation by the ascendant and expanding operations of industrial mining. In crude terms, the volcanic eruption was a rare instance of an artistic landscape whose horizontal format could nonetheless accommodate and narrativize luminous and material interactivity between the surface and subsurface worlds. Without claiming that the portrayals of volcanic eruptions knowingly encoded anxiety about the extrusion of harmful flows of waste from mines, I'm suggesting that such portrayals do signal the growing prominence of an understanding of the subsurface world as a space in which the circulation of value-intensive, quote-unquote, natural resources was accompanied by the circulation of dangerous, powerful waste that threatened to burst forth into a terrain of lived human experience. I close with Turner. Perhaps this is what ultimately drew the artist J.M.W. Turner to paint the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, as well as the earlier eruption of La Soufrière on the Caribbean island of St. Vincent in 1812. We normally understand 18th century portrayals of nocturnal eruptions to register a deep artistic investment in the Burkean sublime and the contrastive tonal challenges of depicting an eruption alongside moonlight and water. As I've discussed, such images were also deeply marked by the practices and consequences of industrial mining. Michel Serres once observed that Turner's paintings, especially those depicting the operations of steam power, replicate the effects of combustion in their conversion of pigmented materiality into light and energy. So the paintings themselves kind of enact combustion. Turner's vortex-like landscapes featuring steamships bear witness to the early stages of what Nathan Hensley describes as the suicidal inferno of fossil capitalism. Turner's eruption scenes could themselves be understood as portrayals of the combustive protocols of industrial modernity. Silhouetted in the right foreground of the painting, a modest rowboat contrasts the explosive power of the distant eruption with the declining importance of traditional sources of energy and labor, and especially sort of animal and human metabolic power. So rather than return to the space of the mine, I'll close by looking outward to the broader extractive stakes of this image. Whereas Turner's later portrayal of the eruption of Vesuvius illuminates the foreground and midground of the surrounding landscapes, his painting of La Soufrière shrouds much of the environment in obscurity. In practical terms, the artist would not have known what St. Vincent looked like. He never visited the Caribbean, and Turner based his painting instead on a sketch made by Hugh Perry Keane, a British planter and enslaver who was on the island during the eruption. If Turner was more attentive than most to the conditions of fossil capital, this painting encodes an awareness of additional geographies of extraction and exploitation, other spatial axes along which the protocols of European economic interest were operating. In the years separating Volaire's painting of Vesuvius and Turner's painting of La Soufrière, volcanic eruptions had become a pervasive metaphor for the events of the French Revolution and other political uprisings. The eruption signaled not only the dramatic reversal of existing political hierarchies and the collective power of the people, or le peuple, but it also indicated a conversion of a seemingly inert topographical formation, i.e. a mountain, into an explosive source of destruction. And Revolutionary era mining treatises are wild and very fun. In any case, in one famous example, Sylvain Maréchal's play, The Last Judgment of Kings from 1793, imagines the monarchs of Europe stranded on a volcanic island whose eruption at the end of the play kills them all. And an inscription on a rock that sat at the front of the stage reads, in translation, quote, "For a neighbor, it is better to have a volcano than a king," end quote. The indigenous Caribs of St. Vincent had lost their second major war against the British during the closing years of the French Revolution. So St. Vincent, at the time of Turner's painting, had both a volcano and a king. Its tobacco, coffee, cotton, indigo, cocoa, and sugar plantations, which were worked by enslaved Africans, were a major source of economic value for British landowners and for the nation. And Turner pictures not the valuable plantations that covered the topographical surface of the island, but only the explosive power rising up from beneath it. Turner's painting of La Soufrière evokes the possibility of other paroxysms, other powerful forces that were both set in motion by and posed an imminent threat to European extractive capitalism at the end of the 19th century. At the turn of the 19th century. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that paper, Steph. It was incredibly rich. I think everyone else will agree. So yeah, I'll open the floor to questions. Oh, there's already one from Bethany. Bethany, do you want to come on and ask? Or do I read it out, Elaine? You can.
I usually invite the questioner to ask, and Alison has one after Bethany.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, Bethany says it's construction, so I'll read it for her. So Bethany asks, I'd love to know more about how the paintings shown here used mined materials in their creation. So have you looked into the pigments to see what kinds of mines or even eruptions the colors might have come from?
That's a great question. And I think one of the most important kind of methodological turns that has been kind of converging with an interest in environmental history and the history of kind of resource extraction is obviously this focus on materiality. So especially in the German context, for instance, cobalt was found in those mountains, and it was that regional cobalt that was used for artist pigment and also for things like porcelain. So in some cases, the relationship was quite local in a sense, in a way that they would have been aware of. I mean, obviously, there's this much longer history of painters using mined materials like lapis from Afghanistan for their blue. But you know, Turner's I think Turner's really due for a rethink, because in his canvases you're also seeing India yellow, right, which is produced by cow's urine in India under these extreme, I mean, basically deadly conditions. The cows only lived for about 2 years. So there's a convergence of multiple kind of geographies of extraction and exploitation in the material of the pigment. And something else that I haven't really thought about, but which I think is quite exciting, is also to think about the very porous stone, which enables the invention of lithography in the late 18th century, which is also from German mountains. And, you know, to what extent there's an awareness of that relationship, I think deserves further attention. And, you know, some media historians, I'm going to wrap this answer up, but there's just so much there. There are some media historians and literary historians who have alleged, you know, that the Earth itself is this medium, and remains, you know, something that mediates and is essential to visual technologies, representational technologies. But literary historians have also begun to think about romanticism as something that emerges from the mind at the turn of the 19th century. And I think it's a question that bears posing to artistic romanticism as well. To what extent is it from the mind and knows itself to be, or is it sort of, does it have to efface that relationship? Can it not accommodate the, you know, the close proximity of those two things? I mean, when Goethe goes through some of the mountain ranges, he is with von Trebra, who was a good friend of his. So these worlds are not sort of theoretically adjacent. Like, you have a romantic figure and a mining administrator, you know, traveling together and exploring the landscape together.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Alison, did you want to? I see you've already turned your camera on.
Thanks so much for a wonderful paper. And I wonder if you could talk more about the formal challenge of representing waste. It just seems like waste is sort of categorically resistant to form. So in terms of the weather, the water, or, you know, I see the volcano and the gas. That's a wonderful kind of way of illustrating the invisibility of the gases. But are there other kinds of techniques for representing waste?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. And I don't have a fully developed way of accounting for it. I think Vittoria de Palma has a book called Wasteland, A History. And so she's probably done the most work of thinking about 18th century landscape and waste. And waste are these sort of zones of possibility and of decay, and things get sort of categorized as wasteland. And that's a very kind of political and socially determined category. But I also think there's an interesting question about kind of the value. If waste is that which doesn't have capturable value, then that might also be true for the artist. I mean, I'm extremely hard pressed to find, it took me ages to think about what kind of image I would put on one of those slides when I ended up with the water drainage system, because, you know, that's exactly what is supposedly not worth picturing. And so there's some interesting thing there about waste and thresholds of visibility that I can't put my finger on, but which I think your question is like driving at in this very important way.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Also, just to go back to Bethany's question, I thought it was interesting. Kind of reminded me a little bit of Kate Nichols' work about kind of animals and pigments which come from animals and animal kind of, yeah, that kind of relationship between the kind of artwork, puppy barking, apologies, between the artwork and the natural world. Okay, so there's a question in the chat, and then I'll come to Kevin. So this is from Catherine. She has no microphone, so please read. The mining prints, etc. Did they appear in books for those in the industry, or were they for sale to the general public? So who is the kind of audience for those mining prints?
Thank you for that question, and it varies and it changes. I mean, and it really also varies by kind of cultural context, because in Germany, geology and mineralogy and also mining were considered more as kind of subjects of casual interest for the educated elite, especially in places like Dresden, which is right next to the center of mining knowledge in Europe at the time. Whereas in Britain, mining retains this association with kind of industry. And therefore you see much later kind of uptake of interest, serious interest in mining, mineralogy, and geology, just because it's not sort of a fashionable pastime for educated elites. But the coal diagram that I showed you at the end was in basically a sort of general interest book. And it's a much cheaper, simpler print. Whereas the von Trebra was very expensive. And tellingly, it was quickly translated into French and never translated into English. So again, these very kind of different trajectories. But that would have been a kind of a luxury object that I think people, so in both cases, you had sort of people who weren't miners interfacing with them, but they did also have very technical use value. And the von Trebra text is extremely technical, and someone who wasn't a mining administrator would never bother to read. It's just like lists and lists of like the different historical yields of a certain mine, and then they shifted the kind of water wheel they were using, and then like 30 years of how the yields changed. It was very technical.
Great, thanks. Kevin, did you want to turn your camera and mic on?
Hi, yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I thought that was a fascinating talk. I kind of have two quick questions. The first is whether this kind of vertical turn you're tracking, that opened up, these different representations of the subterranean, if there was a comparable turn to like the subaquatic, if like, thinking vertically also applied to how people thought about, beneath the surface of the ocean or beneath the surface of the sea. That's my first question. And then my second question is, as you were talking about, as you were showing the images of St. Vincent from the Turner painting, it was making me kind of wonder if there's any kind of like colonial, if there's a kind of colonizing impulse at work beneath this, this vertical turn, if there was beyond, and by that I mean beyond merely extracting resources from the subterranean, if there was an attempt to actually like view these places as habitable or colonizable in other forms, or if it was simply just like sites of extraction, sites of resource plunder.
Thank you for that. It's a really good question, and I'll start with the colonial question. And I can't take any credit for this because Patrick Anthony is the one who's sort of been, from whom I've been learning about this. But in a book that he's completing, he specifically points out that the science of stratigraphy, so this kind of diagrammatic way of layering, of picturing these vertical kind of layers that are a hypothetical cross-section of a piece of Earth, but also stratigraphy as the science of understanding that the sequence in which different rock formations exist is an index of the historical sequence of their formation. So you can read both time, and depth along the same axis, and it's a vertical axis. And he points out that this is used especially in Latin America. I mean, Humboldt is, traveling through Latin America, and they use the stratigraphic diagram of these mountains to basically allege that mining, the depths of the earth are kind of consistent in a way across these colonial geographies, and it absolutely motivates and informs the expansion of German mining in Latin America. They're thinking, you know, it's the same everywhere, and we've uncovered the science of stratigraphy and mining, so we can just export that directly to Latin America. And interestingly, around Humboldt, it's also very explicitly racialized early on, because some of these diagrams, including Humboldt's of these mountain ranges in Latin America, associate different elevation levels with different categories of indigenous people who kind of thrive at these elevation levels and can tolerate relative amounts of oxygen. So that also kind of justifies, like, you know, these people are like physically, constitutionally best suited to mining, so we can just employ them in this way. And I have no good answer to this question about aquatic depths. I mean, I would love it if you would research it and then you could come back and tell us. I mean, there is an interesting, you know, I can't speak to bodies of water, but because, you know, underground, you know, the deeper you go, the more water you encounter. So the mine is also a kind of an aquatic space. And one of the big problems of mining is trying to like control this influx of water. And mines also have weather. You find miners talking about the different kinds of air and air currents that they encounter. And that was life-saving knowledge, because if you could detect the buildup of fire damp, you could prevent like death or explosion. So in some ways, the space of the mine was also a landscape that had air, that had weather patterns, and that had water. And I think that also bears thinking about. And I'll just mention in closing one anecdote of my, when I was reading about fire damp, my favorite treatment for fire damp, because it was a problem that was quite common. And I found one mid 18th century British text on it, which said, you know, if a miner is falls ill due to fire damp, you know, you should revive him with several glasses of high quality ale, and that will prevent kind of lasting damage, which seemed kind of like a slightly self-serving medicine. In any case, yeah, thank you for that, Kevin.
Fascinating. And Kevin, I think you've probably seen it, but there's a little response to your query in the chat, which is worth looking at. Lucy, do you want to? Yeah, hi.
Sorry, many thanks for the paper, which was fascinating. I've got a quick response to the question about the water, and then a question. It just made me think of Agricola writing about mining and his defense of mining being partly predicated on visibility and invisibility. So I guess the argument that just because we can't see into the ground, we shouldn't not exploit it. He compares that to fishing. And says just because you can't see into a depth of water doesn't mean that, you know, we don't accept fishing as feasible. So I don't know, it's not about a visualization of sort of subaquatic space, but nonetheless he is thinking about that sort of difficulty of seeing. So I think that's in maybe the preface to one of his works, or the first chapter. But it was really just a broader question actually about that early modern material and precedents for the, I guess, not necessarily an earlier vertical turn, but there are some examples, I guess, of that vertical visualization, but perhaps more linked to a verticality that maps onto religious ideas as well, of a sort of heaven and hell. The examples I've seen are either kind of deliberately alluding to sort of schemes you might associate with a lost judgment, say, or one example I can think of is a transfiguration, where instead of the wanderer on his mountain, you've got Christ on his mountain and miners beneath. And so my question really was, when does that die out, or is there any overlap between those kind of images and the ones you're looking at in a kind of later, early modern 18th, 19th century context? Sorry, it was a bit rambly.
No, that's so interesting. Thank you. And that's I mean, I think I think the point you make about visibility and the underwater is spot on, and I thank you for sharing that, because I hadn't really thought about it in that way. And I'm not an expert on the visual culture of early modern mining in any way, but I would say a few things. So firstly, there is under the sign of Enlightenment thought, you do see different sort of diagrammatic modes that are emerging alongside what I would call industrial mining on a very different scale, and part of these interlocking systems of extraction. But you do see a lot of, you'll find allegorical figures where there's sort of like the even in the 19th century, like the angel of commerce is, helping, is like pouring water into the into the vats that are rinsing the ore and separating the waste. So I do think that there's like this vestigial kind of semi-religious way of thinking about it, which also has to do with the kind of I think the physiocratic assertion in the 18th century that the human has this sort of moral compulsion, like this moral obligation to make the land of the nation as profitable as possible. So maybe it becomes more sort of dispersed into this system of morality rather than a kind of religious framework. But I think, I think there's a lot of overlap. And one of the things that I've been trying to explore is, where and when do vertical ways of picturing and understanding space really supplant horizontal ones? Really they're coexisting, of course. And the vertical is so challenging that I think at a certain point, landscape artists have to sort of abandon trying to accommodate that, because it is so at odds with the format and logic of landscape painting. And I'd have to think more about it, but thank you, Lucy. It's really such an interesting point that you've made, and also this question, which I haven't figured out. And if you figured that one out, also please let me know.
Well, I look forward to the book. I look forward to talking outside the remit of your external examining for Bristol. And yeah, thanks for a really interesting paper.
Well, thank you, Lucy. It's the thrilling subject of external examining.
There's a really lovely comment from Christy in the chat about which is worth having a look at, Steph, which is about her living in a mining community in Ontario, and people thinking that the buildup of minerals there was because they thought it was because of an ancient volcano, but actually the result of a meteorite crashing, and thinking about the connection between miners as reverse astronomers. But Chrissy's also asked a question about how the illustrations of individual figures within the works kind of fit within this analysis that you're doing. So what role do the people, the miners, the kind of actors, I guess, play in the picture?
That's a great question. And in pulling up the chat, I also see Daniela flagged Kimia's work, which is a great point of reference. I completely agree. I haven't read Killing Quigley, so that's one for my list. So thank you, Marnie, for bringing that up. The human figures, it's not until later in the 19th century that you see a real culture of foregrounding the work of the labor. And one of the ideas I'm interested in with that mining, with the whole kind of category of mining ventilation diagrams, is that they picture an ideal mine which has no people in it, in the sense that the flows are self-sustaining and self-circulating. And I also think, it's acute with those mining ventilation diagrams because they're deeply antagonistic to a kind of human perceptual encounter with the mine, the landscape. So Von Trebra says, and these are large prints, mining is going to enable you to have this fictional, glorious, intensely visual encounter with the depths of the earth. And the human act of viewing the landscape becomes less important. And so, you can also really see the decline of a certain Enlightenment framework there, I think. But later in the 19th century, there are really good, really vivid illustrations of mining communities and mining labor. But for them, I think there's more work that I could be doing on some of the human figures, but often they're just like these little specks and they're beholding a little light. So they're kind of the particularities of the kind of work they do and the kind of physicality that it requires, and the different people undertaking them is really underrepresented. Because, for instance, working those air doors, had to be done by young boys because they're in these quite tight spots. So the mine was also like an intergenerational social space. And the mining diagrams don't really register that until about a third of the way into the 19th century, as far as I'm aware, at least.
Brilliant. I think we've run out of time, actually.
I just told Daniela she can ask her one last question.
Okay.
And
Daniela,
I'm going to use this as a plug to please join us next month when Daniela is going to be our speaker. So we're going to let her have the last word today.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, Daniela.
I chatted Elena. I was like, when is this supposed to end? I don't want to, I can always reach out to Stephanie. Stephanie, thank you so much. I'm so excited to get this glimpse, this taste of your upcoming book, or this side things. I was wondering if, having worked on the Dupré caricature myself, and its relationship to sort of revolutionary rhetoric, I was wondering about the role of caricature in some of these depictions and sort of how that comes into play. And are there mining caricatures? Does the mine serve in a cognate way to sort of the volcano in that mode? And I understand this might not be material that you've sort of delved into deeply, but you showed it to us twice, so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask that question.
No, thank you, and thank you for listening and engaging. And yeah, absolutely fair enough. And I think volcanic eruptions were present in visual culture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Europe, at least in the capitals, in a way that just really wasn't true of mines. So the fact that you had kind of popular attractions, and you might have like a volcanic eruption as a sort of luminous set piece at the end of a play, things like that. And you don't have that with mining. And some of it, I think, is it varies a lot, but industrial mining in France and Britain really lags behind Germany and Sweden. And so too does sort of public consciousness of it. And it's really around, in the early 19th century, you start having these extremely widely reported accounts of mining explosions. And that's when that captures people's attention, I think, because it's so spectacular, and also it's got this kind of high body count, and then you get these really dramatic narrative accounts of them, which I think are a lot like the popular narrative accounts of volcanic eruptions from the late 18th century. I think they're modeled on that. And so I think that's when that's when they enter kind of more of a mainstream visual culture, such that they would be a subject of caricature. But I haven't really found any. I think for the most part, people just weren't really thinking about the mine as a space. And these mining communities were really physically isolated. And transit and communication weren't as developed. But I also think there's some interesting thing about like the invisibility of the mine, and then its spectacular entrance into like the field of ordinary human visibility, which I think would coincide then with its interface with things like politics and other subjects of caricature. But I'd really love to chat with you more about it.
Yeah, just to follow up, I wonder about the need for the human intervention in the sense of the high death count in these explosions to kind of make it visible, right? Like, and maybe that ties a little bit into the previous question about like where the people are. right? In a way that you don't need, like you always have the staffage figures and representations of the volcanoes exploding. Like what I'm interested in what their role is, but they're kind of supplemental, while as to make the mining visible, like, and to make it enter that visual culture, it seems like the human impact is more central. Maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
no, I think that's right. And you do have like human staffage in some of the early kind of geological illustrations where there is a conjunction of a sort of stratigraphic diagram and a landscape element. And basically the landscape element just gets slowly, it's pushed and pushed and pushed. I mean, literally, like it gets higher and higher up the page. And then at a certain point, they're just like, whatever, you know, 2 tufts of grass will do it. But I think your point about kind of the human and visibility is also really interesting with the mining explosions, because what is triggered by is the light. And the miners bring candles and lamps into the mine to create fields of visibility. So like the human has to, and yet there's this tension with the kind of the vision and annihilating for them operation of an explosion. So there is this, like, part of how the explosions begin is this effort to enforce human visibility in a space that doesn't normally accommodate it.
Thank you so much. Can everyone please join me in thanking Stephanie for her amazing talk and questions and answers and amazing pictures as well. I'm still struck by the thought of the volcano coming up and the meteorite coming down, and how the vertical is working in a kind of cosmological plane. And please, just another plug for next month, when Daniela Berman will be giving a talk on aesthetics in times of turmoil, so that you can book your tickets for that through Humanitix as well. Thank you again for giving us an hour of your day, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your month, and I see you all back here in the Zoom room in May. So thank you again, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. That was brilliant.
Wonderful. Thank you. Such a pleasure.
You had such a good